Hey guys, Lumen02. I'm going to be doing some 93, 94 old school content, and you'll get to see a fishing attempt with this deck, and then I'm going to do a relatively quick deck tech on what you have in front of you, which I'm calling Atog Mechanic. It's really a mud aggro list that utilizes Atog, and then Orcish Mechanics up here. So let me get the display window up for folks who are not as familiar with the 93-94 format. We'll be able to review the cards. So what you have on the far left-hand side here is just our mana base, which is essentially 12 mountains. Supplementing that, you have 4 strip mines, which operate as both mana for a relatively large colorless-based deck that only utilizes red cards as well to win. So strip mine is a 4 of, is legal in the EC under the EC rules. If you're playing by Swedish or European rules, you'll tend to only run 1. Additionally, on the far right-hand side over here, you have the Mishra's Factories, which also facilitate making colorless mana, but also can convert into threats over time or as the situation determines to be necessary. Another positive synergy with Mishra's Factory is that although it cannot attack the turn it comes into play, it can be activated the turn it comes into play, and essentially it acts as a miniature giant growth, either for Atog or Orcish Mechanic if all you need is 2 damage to be able to push through the final points that you require. So it actually in some ways operates as if it had haste because of what it can do with the other creatures in the deck. So it may look like a mana light deck because we just covered the 12 mountains, but essentially that puts us up to 20 mana sources. And then we have all of the fast mana. So we have Soul Ring, 4 mana vaults, Black Lotus, and then basically all of the power, all of the Moxen. So the deck does run 31 mana sources. However, the one cool thing about this deck, and as I go through it, you'll kind of see this is a synergy that's built into this style of deck. And this is by no means like an original deck idea. This is a deck archetype that is not uncommon in 93-94 for newer viewers. And for those of you that know the format, you'll know this is already a format, or is already kind of a format, I wouldn't say staple, but it's a deck you've probably seen around. But the cool thing about the deck is that it's able to run a lot of fast mana because the marginal utility of mana over time can be transmuted into damage in this deck with cards like Atog right here, which says sacrifice an artifact, it gains +2/+2, which we kind of explain that synergy with Mishra's Factory as well. And then Orcish Mechanics, which says, hey, sacrifice an artifact and it deals 2 damage to any target. Additionally, we also have a Fireball in the deck, so the increased volume of mana in this deck is actually not horrendous because it does convert into a decent amount of mana, which can be used to Fireball for the last few points that you need. Alright, going to the next pile here, you actually have other ways that we can kill our opponents, but a lot of them lose utility over time. So Ankh of Mishra in the early game is exceedingly powerful because if you're playing against a control deck, which a lot of the decks that are blue tend to want to play their lands, Ankh of Mishra can get in 4 to 6 points of damage, which is extremely relevant when you're just needing to get in 2 to 3 more points with like an Orcish Mechanics or an Atog to finish them off, or possibly just Lightning Bolt or Fireball. Additionally, because they are artifacts, they sacrifice to both the Orcish Mechanics, which says tap, sacrifice an artifact, deals 2 damage to any target, which includes an opponent's face, or Atog, where it gets +2/+2. Copper Tablet, all it says, very simple, each player takes 1 damage on their upkeep. So this, over time, over 3 to 4 turns, equals up to a lot of damage, and all at once can be turned into burst damage, essentially like a Fireball with the Atog, or over time with the Orcish Mechanics. Black Vice, if you get this down very early, 1 to 2 of them very early, can generally end the game pretty quickly, as, if you get this on the play, you're doing Lightning Bolt damage to your opponent during their draw step. You have 4 of these. Now, obviously, cards like Black Vice and Ankh of Mishra lose utility over time because eventually an opponent can just hold lands in their hand if they have enough to function, or they can just play out their hand very rapidly because there is, broken power mana inside this format, and have a relatively low hand size. So after the Black Vice gets in, 3, maybe 6 points of damage, drawing them after that is not per se great, but you're able to transmute them essentially into a Fireball after doing so. So I think in a lot of ways you can treat Black Vice and Ankh of Mishra like Goblin Guide in the burn deck. Goblin Guide ideally gets in 4 to 6 points of damage, and after that it kind of loses all utility, and then you utilize your burn to go to face. Similar in this deck, so you basically do that with your artifacts over here, and then you utilize your Chain Lightnings and Lightning Bolts to supplement that plan to do the last 10 points, or maybe 9 points, or maybe 6 points of damage to finish the game out. As far as permanent threats go, like we said, we have basically 8 attackers. The Orcish Mechanics can attack, but typically speaking, you're not attacking with them. But you have the Atogs and the Mishra's Factory to kind of finish them off. As far as draw goes, the deck only runs 1 draw spell, and that is a Wheel of Fortune. It says each player discards their hand, then draws 7 cards. Pretty powerful in a deck like this where it can dump its hand relatively fast. Jumping to the sideboard, we have, like we were saying, there's a lot of blue decks in the format. It's 93, 94. Ancestral Recall, Time Twister, Time Walk. These are all great cards, and they're all in the format. So a lot of folks tend to play blue because it probably is the most powerful color during this time, and possibly even still today, some may argue. Pyroblast allows you to stop a lot of the more potent spells inside the format, allows you to kill some of the best threats like Serendipifreets. So it's a pretty flexible spell and a great one for the sideboard. We have 2 Shatters because it tends to be a very artifact-laden format, and sometimes you'll just run into an artifact you cannot stop. That said, generally speaking, you don't need a ton of these because you don't really have to attack to win the game with this deck because you have so many spells that just do damage directly. But Cop R can become a problem at certain points in the game, and you'll have to rely on basically getting early points of damage with your red spells, and then hopefully utilizing Copper Tablet to finish that off. Moving onward, you also have City in a Bottle, which stops all of the Cities of Brass, stops Library of Alexandria, stops Serendipifreet, stops Juzam Jin, stops a lot of really relevant cards in this format, and it also just sacks to an Atog as well, or an Orcish Mechanics. Winter Orb, a very powerful effect against the more controlling decks. It's essentially like a secondary copy of Blood Moon, which we also have 2 Blood Moons, excepting that it does not die to Blue Elemental Blast. So if an opponent's sideboard is to bring in Blue Elemental Blast, they can obviously kill the Moon relatively easily, but they're going to have Disenchant for the Winter Orb or some other effect that gets it like Crumble to get rid of it. And this deck doesn't really need to untap a ton of its lands. I mean, the only lands it really cares about untapping are the ones that attack, i.e. Mishra's Factory. So you tend to be pretty fine with just having the Winter Orbs. You could even run these main if you wanted to. 2 Blood Moons, yes, it does turn off our Strip Mines and our Mishra's Factories, but ostensibly that's not really... You're playing this against decks where it does far more to them than it does to you. And the addition of some extra red mana is not as bad as it generally is going to be to, decks like the deck where, they're a 5-color control deck that relies a lot on their artifact mana to fix for them, as well as their Cities of Brass. 2 by Suchi. Some formats or some games you're just going to want additional grunt power. This is a very efficient threat in the format. I do think it's better in this version of the deck than Juggernaut because it does have 4 toughness, which makes it lightning bolt proof. Juggernaut's not really a card that worries this deck. As you can see, we have 8 main deck ways of dealing with a Juggernaut. But Suchi, Triskelion, and Tetravis all tend to be a little bit tougher. Suchi kind of made the cut before the other 2 because it is very easy to get a Suchi down turn 1 with 3 by Mana Vaults. Whereas with Tetravis and Triskelion, you either want to be really cheating them in with like a Hell's Caretaker, aka a Machine style deck, or with Mishra's Workshop, which allows you to ramp them in very easily turn 1 or turn 2, depending on how much artifact mana you have with your land drop. Last card is Earthquake. It just tends to be very good against the creature decks. It can also get in the final couple points of damage that you may need. It's an additional fireball, essentially, but it's also very good against the White Weenie style decks, where they may flood the board with a lot of first strikers or blockers, and Atog just can't quite get through the damage that it needs to get through to win the game. Although I will say, Earthquake I don't think is necessary, because Orcish Mechanics tends to deal pretty well with like the Weenie style decks, and with like the Flying Men style decks of the format. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and give this a quick fish, and I'll just show you kind of how the deck functions real quick. It tends to be a turn 4 to turn 5 deck in the solitaire matches or the fishing attempts that I've run it through so far. So we'll go ahead and turn off this example window. Alright, this hand looks acceptable here. I think the sequence of play for this hand would likely be a turn 1 Black Vice plus Chain Lightning, and then followed up with an Atog to do some damage. Keep in mind this hand's going to be a little bit slower in fishing because our opponent, quote-unquote, is ourselves. So we're going to dump a significant portion of our hand by playing the Black Vice plus the Ruby plus a Mountain Out and the Chain Lightning to the tune of down to 3 cards. However, fishing does have essentially multiplayer mulligan rules where you draw the first turn, so it is one lack of reality that you can't really bait in Moto. So Chain Lightning, go to the opponent, back to us, draw, take no damage off Vice due to the hand size. At this point in time, we're going to go ahead and Chain Lightning again, down to 14. Atog, the frailty of this hand is certainly that it does kind of fail to Swords to Plowshares. So, you don't want to let your testing results with any deck allow you to make the false assumption that a deck is faster than it is. Alright, at this point, we're going to sack the Black Vice just because we are fishing right now, even though in reality it could be doing the most significant amount of damage to our opponent. At this point, we would have hit our opponent for half their life total. We are on turn 4, essentially. I'm going to play out the Ankh, and assume that my own land drop would be damage my opponent was taking. I think at this point in time, it probably makes the most sense to keep the Ankh, put myself down to 4, draw for the turn, find Factory. At this point, we have lethal, so we take damage off Ankh, activate Factory, sack Factory to Atog, sack Ankh to Tog, and then dome in for 5 damage down to -3. So that is a turn 5 kill with the deck. Not really the most optimal draw. It was fairly land heavy. I did have 4 lands in that draw that I really didn't. I probably wanted 2 less. The Factory and 2 Mountains was probably adequate. The Black Vice obviously doesn't represent how much damage it could do in an actual game very well when you're fishing, because especially on a speed deck like this, you're just not going to get a good representation of it. But in some matchups, it doesn't do anything whatsoever as well. You know, like against like 5-color Dreams where they can dump their hand really fast. But still, you know, fairly quick deck, fairly fast. I do also kind of like, you know, the utility that you get with the Orcish Mechanics. I think Orcish Mechanics is generally, I mean, if you look at this card, it does not look good. I think it would probably be generally be frowned upon as a bad card. I mean, heck, they just reprinted this guy as a 1/2 in Dominaria, and for 1 less mana, but I believe it's tap a red and then do the same effect. I think it's Orcish Vandals or something like that. But this guy's actually pretty good in this deck because we have a lot of cards that lose utility fairly rapidly. Like they have diminishing returns over time. And this guy kind of just says, okay, well, we got that, but we're going to convert these artifacts that have diminishing returns into damage. So I think his potential in this deck is kind of reached to a point where it's actually quite good. I mean, I could also see playing like a blue-red version of this, possibly, but generally in your aggro decks you want them to be as consistent as possible, and playing an additional color tends to make it a little less consistent. Plus, once you dip into blue, you kind of want to start playing power blue cards. But I think you could also play like Sage of Lat-Nam in this deck, where you just like sack an Ankh of Mishra or sack like a Black Vice after it loses utility. Try to draw into some burn or something like that. I mean, I guess it does allow you to also play like Psionic Blast as well, possibly even Serendib, but obviously with Serendib, then the City in a Bottle becomes a little less viable as a sideboard card. But you also do get Beb. That all said, you know, like where does this deck lose out? It loses out a little bit in the Circle Protection red matchup, so at that point you're kind of, you know, relying on your Mishra's Factories and your artifact sources of damage to do their work. Bring in some Suchis, hope they can do some work as well. That same style of deck, you know, may or may not have access to Energy Flux, which is also a tough tough card to beat. However, I think you can with this deck because Atog generally says like, hey, I don't really care about. What's going to happen with that deck is you're just going to sacrifice all this stuff on your upkeep when the trigger hits the stack. Atog will get huge. If they have the Swords to Plowshares, you'll probably lose, or you're probably like, you know, you'll lose your board. You'll gain a decent bit of life if they allow you to do it, or you can spew off some artifacts before the trigger hits the stack with Orcish Mechanics, etc. So there are a few hate cards that can get this deck, but it is relatively quick. I think it is relatively. It's not the most commonly played deck or like decks of this style. I'm sure Orcish Mechanics have been played before in it, but I kind of saw this card and was like, you know, I know what Atog does. It's obviously a pauper deck. Still to this day, but I wanted to kind of play with mechanics and kind of see how the card would do, and I think, you know, this is the style of deck that it would want to be played in. So I hope you guys enjoyed the rather quick deck tech and the fishing attempt with the deck. I will try to find some opponents and actually do some live testing with this deck, as it's not very typical that I do a lot of aggro content on 93-94. I do think aggro is quite cool. I am practicing this one under EC rules. I think the 4 of Strip Mine tends to not favor, but at least make more viable the aggressive decks. I think when you only have 1 Strip Mine, the Library of Alexandria decks, the blue decks, tend to be a little bit overpowering. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just I think it makes a difference in how the format plays out. And I tend to think that if you want increased viability of all archetypes to compete on a decent level, you generally want to have Strip Mine unrestricted, because the options for prison and prison control are just so strong in under the European ban set. So, hope you guys enjoyed this, and like I said, you'll probably see this deck again relatively soon, and I'll be playing a live opponent, hopefully on MTGO or some other platform, so we can test it out. Alright guys, take care now, and go aggro.